Welcome to episode 8 of Let's Rage Together, a podcast where two friends talk about the politics of total liberation and related topics.
We annihilated the world before your very ears.
You can't handle the truth.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 8th episode of Let's Rage Together. I'm Taryn,
And I'm Pete.
and today we are discussing white privilege. This is actually the second time we're recording this episode because unfortunately something went wrong and our last recording ended up using laptop sound and it was really terrible. So we're redoing this. And for those of you who have not ever tried to do a podcast, and what we didn't realize before we started a podcast is that it's a lot of work.
This is very time consuming.
It takes a lot of hours. We love it though. We love doing this podcast, but it is a lot of hard work. And the recording takes a few hours, editing takes a lot of hours, and now we're having to redo this.
And never mind planning.
Reading up. Yeah, it's a lot of work. So with that said, if you want to support us and help us make it a little bit more sustainable, it would be really cool if you could go to our site letsragetogether.co.za and check out the Patreon link. And if you want to become a Patreon supporter, then there are some cool little gifts that we'll give you at certain levels. We've got tote bags, we've got mugs, we've got stickers. If you don't want to do that, you can also give a once-off donation. But there are also other ways you can help us as well.
Yeah, we also have PayPal. You can also just spread the word. I think word of mouth is always going to be the best. Interact with us online. We have Facebook and Instagram at Let's Rage Together Podcast. And share stuff if you think it's relevant. Talk to people.
And if you feel like giving a rating or review, that would also help so that more people can find out about the podcast.
Yeah, but also don't do any of this if you don't feel like it. So
Yeah,
thanks.
only if you want to.
And if anyone has any listener comments or concerns or questions or anything, you can email us on letsragetogetherpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. And thank you so much to Carissa, Kashay, Kimberly, and Wes for the listener feedback on the last episode we did on defining veganism. There was a lot more feedback, but these people gave more in-depth kind of reflective feedback, and we really appreciate any feedback whatsoever.
Yeah, we got quite an extensive email from Carissa. So I just wanted to share some of her thoughts about the last episode. And as part of the discussion on defining veganism, we also talked a little bit about the Liberation Pledge. And Carissa said that she was glad we discussed the Liberation Pledge because she was considering taking it over the festive season, but she's realized that it is quite self-focused to be motivated by her feelings about seeing animal flesh being eaten at the same table, and that being present as a vegan allows for conversations and normalizing veganism. But Carissa also said, to quote from her email, "I had a better response by bringing our buffalo cauliflower wings and crumbed mushrooms and had everyone else eat them and enjoy them and then go hungry because they didn't eat all the animal products but ate all our food. My compassion to human animals needs reminding that I was also eating animals once, and it's fucking horrifying once you wake up, but I need to not be the weird one and show you can function and live and be happy without using animal products." So thanks for that, Carissa. It was cool to get that kind of feedback, and it's nice that the discussion kind of got you thinking about the Liberation Pledge as well.
Yeah, thanks, Carissa. It's really amazing for us to get emails like that where someone has really put in time and effort to, contact us and tell us what they think. And thank you to everyone who sent in their dog and cat photos. If you would like to get your companion animals or any animals featured on our Facebook or Instagram stories, send them through and we'll put them up. Tell us a little story about them or something. In this world of shit, it's sometimes great to get some cool animal photos. Any and all animals.
Yeah, exactly. But without further ado, it's time for our regular Rad and Bad section. And this is the section of the show where we discuss a couple of things that we either find rad or bad that don't necessarily warrant a full episode, but that we think we should just have a little discussion about.
It's time for the bad and the rad.
So Pete, do you have any bads or rads today?
I am, if people haven't figured out by now, a pretty pessimistic, cynical person, and most likely I have a list of 50 bads.
Just call him Pessimist Pete.
All the time. But I'm going to try to take it easy today. There's been one bad that has popped up recently that is really getting to me because in general, the animal rights and vegan community gets to me because it seems so apolitical and it really bugs me. But especially lately, there's been a lot of conversation around this app called Beauty Pass, which models can use to get free food or gym memberships or club entry or clothes or whatever, as far as I understand it. There's even a local restaurant in Cape Town called Lekker Vegan, who I really like, actually.
Yeah, their food is really good.
Yeah, even if it is just fries, but it's good.
Fries meaning the brand, not just fries, although there are fries on there and fries.
Yeah, like fries faux meats, but they also have plays on like local kind of cuisine, which is cool. But I didn't know, but they endorsed this app called Beauty Pass, which basically you get free shit because you look good.
Yeah, so models can come there and get a free meal just because they're models, and will get other people to hear about the restaurants.
And to me, this is inconsistent. It doesn't make sense. I'm sorry, but it's unacceptable to promote veganism through problematic ways. Like we've seen Peter do, for example. You can't use sexism to promote veganism. It's inconsistent, and it's just kind of shitty to ride on the back of another oppression to push your agenda. There's a lot of critique online about this. There's a Times Live article that's pretty good. If you just search Beauty Pass Times Live or something, you can read more about it. We can post a link in the show notes, actually. But one of our friends, Aragon, as far as I'm concerned, kind of slammed everyone's arguments and just pointed out, like, how is it possible that anyone does not see what the problem is with this? Because not only are you objectifying women, but also it's perpetuating like a really problematic industry. It's also perpetuating problematic gender stereotypes.
And unrealistic beauty standards.
The list goes on. I mean, even the name, Beauty Pass, like you have a pass for beauty. It's bullshit. The whole way of thinking about it is problematic because Lekker Vegan's argument is that, oh, why can't we exploit the influence of people who have a lot of influence to promote veganism? I'm sorry, but if the veganism you're promoting is sexism and reinforces patriarchy, then it's bullshit. And we don't want anything to do with it. And it doesn't belong in the movement. It's the same kind of thinking as if you had someone who's like, oh, there's this really problematic activist or something, but they have a huge following. So it's fine. We'll give them free food because they'll promote us.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, it's not exactly a new marketing strategy to get so-called influencers or, celebrities to go to a place to be seen. But for something like that to be used as a way to promote veganism is just completely unethical because it's not just about marketing and making money.
Yeah.
You're trying to promote ethics by using shitty ethics.
Yeah, exactly. It's so inconsistent. But if you want to hear why we think that if you are vegan, you should be a feminist, and why you should be a feminist if you are vegan, you should listen to our 5th episode.
Yeah, on
feminism. I regard Beauty Pass and what Lekker Vegan and other institutions are doing as anti-feminist, but completely reinforcing patriarchy. What's your bad, T? Do you have any bads?
I do. I have one bad today. Well, it's kind of 2 bads, but they're very related.
Just one?
Well, I have millions. I actually kind of hate everything at the moment, but this was a recent thing that I heard about, and it really, really made me very sad. So there's an article on Business Live, which we'll link to in the show notes, but they described a recent study that was done called And Then There Was One. And it's about the fact that there seems to now be only one wild roaming elephant remaining in the Knysna forest and surrounding fynbos. And basically what the article discussed was that they did a 15-month study using these motion activated camera trap type things to try and find out how many elephants were in the vicinity, because it's been up for debate how many elephants are actually left in the area. So basically these cameras were set up to record for 15 months, and she's the only elephant that was spotted numerous times in that period of time, but only her and by herself. And the article says that she's about 45 years old and moves in the indigenous forest and fynbos areas on sandparks and neighboring private land. And it's so, so, so depressing because she's probably been alone for years, and elephants are very social animals. So when I heard about this, it's just been making me feel really sad and depressed and full of hatred for humans. And
that's very sad. Like, how did this happen?
Well, the article also says, it is a societal responsibility as we have forced these elephants, which are savanna elephants, into inhospitable forest habitats as a result of hundreds of years of hunting them and chasing them out of their natural habitats. So, as with all environmental shit, we have caused this. We have forced these elephants into unnatural environments, and now they're pretty much all dead.
I read the article too. They even mentioned that the forest food available for the elephant is
poor
nutrients
quality.
deficient.
Yeah.
Which sucks as well.
And it goes on to say, hopefully we humans have learned a nasty lesson, because it is ultimately our fault that we are down to the last elephant here. She is the metaphor for our treatment of all species that live on this planet with us. The saying, the elephant in the room, could not be more apt. She is telling us we are making some big mistakes and we are going to lose a lot more than her if we don't substantially change how we treat and value biodiversity. And it also describes in the article that there are signs of severe stress. She's got, they call it temporal streaming. It almost looks like elephants are kind of crying out the side of the head. And
How do we know they aren't crying though?
Well, it's out of their temporal lobes essentially.
Oh,
like,
not their eyes.
It's not from their eyes. It's like just next to you by where your temple is.
Oh.
So that can be a sign of stress, and they think it's probably because she's lonely.
Oh my god.
It just makes me want to cry.
This is very sad.
Oh, it's so depressing. So anyway, the other night I was just lying in bed thinking about like what she's doing right now.
We should go camp in the National Forest and just hang out with her.
I would honestly love that if we could just somehow tell her that not all humans are shit and we're sorry, but we can hang out with her if she wants that.
Humans are trash.
Yeah. And then related to that, I'm sure if you live in South Africa, you would have heard about this story. We'll link an article in the show notes to a News 24 article. News 24 is not the best news source, but...
avoid the comments section of anything on News 24.
Unless you feel like being instilled with a bunch of rage. But basically the article covered the situation pretty well. And that is one of an elephant named Lammy, who is stuck in the Johannesburg Zoo. So she was born in captivity and is now completely solitary because her companion Kinkle died last year. So Lammy is 39 years old and was born there. So that in itself, I don't even have words.
How are we supposed to do the rest of this episode with you talking about lonely elephants?
Oh, this is really depressing. But anyway, Lammy is also overweight, indicating that she doesn't get enough exercise. Her enclosure has no features conducive to making her walk around. There's no place for her to retreat from screaming crowds, and there's no environmental enrichment or stimulation provided. And the staff members haven't been seen monitoring visitor behavior and enforcing rules or anything like that.
I mean, it's probably a similar situation for most of animals in the zoo.
Yeah. So obviously we hate zoos in themselves. But anyway, one thing that really bugged me is that in this article it says, in the interim, the zoo is engaging with relevant authorities to obtain in-principle support to acquire a companion for Lammy.
Oh my god.
What the hell? So instead of moving Lammy to a sanctuary, let's get another elephant from captivity. And it would have to be from captivity because there's rules about disease clearances and all of that shit. So basically, let's just get another captive animal to give company to the current captive animal. I mean, honestly.
But this also bugs me, and it's something that ties in with speciesism, is how can you assume that just because you're going to get two members of the same species, they're going to get along? For anyone who's seen the cove or blackfish, they've tried to do that. And they say putting a bunch of orca whales in the same pool doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to get along. Just like if you just grab a random bunch of humans and put them in the same room.
It's probably going to be fights.
Exactly. And that is what has happened. So how do they know that when they get this other elephant to provide Lammy company that they're going to even get along in the first place?
Well, exactly. And so the NSPCA, they addressed a letter of demand to the zoo management saying that if they moved forward with obtaining another elephant, the NSPCA would launch an application in the High Court to interdict such action. So the National Council is opposed to them getting another elephant. And Michelle Pickover, who actually wrote the book Animal Rights in South Africa, she was also quoted in an open letter to the zoo saying the current norms and standards of 2008 prohibit the capture of wild elephants for captivity. Thus, the zoo can only acquire an elephant, as it proposes, from other captive facilities that house African elephants free of diseases such as herpes and tuberculosis. This acquisition will likely necessitate the breaking up of a bonded group at the source facility, a highly unethical practice. So just like you're saying, not only is it a question of whether they will get along, but taking another captive elephant away from a group that they are already bonded to.
Yeah, and especially because they're such sociable, highly intelligent animals.
Yeah, imagine you just pick a human out of a family and put them in another family. Come on. So those are my bads. I'm just going to stop there because otherwise I'm just going to rage for like a solid hour.
So Joburg Zoo, please stop being shit.
Or stop existing, actually. Just
turn into a sanctuary.
Anyway, do you have a rad to pick up from that horrible note, Pete?
I mean, I currently don't think anything is really going to make me feel okay after hearing about lonely elephants.
I'm sorry.
But yes, actually, I've read a really good book recently that I finished called Reasons to Stay Alive by Matt Haig. It is a really amazing book, and I can highly recommend it to anyone, especially people who suffer with mental health issues like anxiety and depression. A lot of the self-help books are kind of like flowery and nonsense, honestly. And there's a reason why this book has become so popular, because it is really honest and useful.
And it's just his story mostly, right?
Yeah, because he himself does still suffer with anxiety and depression. And it's like a very real, honest book with very helpful advice and ways of thinking. So I would highly recommend that book. It really helped me. I just found myself taking notes constantly. It's quite a small book and easy to read, but it took me a while to get through it because I would make notes and reread things and go back to chapters, and it was just really cool. I would highly recommend it. So
that's awesome. And on that note, if you are struggling with anxiety or depression, please don't feel bad about getting yourself help. If you need to be on medication, that's totally fine. If you need to go and see someone, that's totally fine. As hard as it is, everyone always says you're not alone, and, speak to someone if you need to. And if you've ever struggled with depression, you know that that's the last thing you probably want to do when you're depressed is speak to anyone.
Yeah, which I know from experience.
Yeah.
And as we've posted pretty often on our social media, it's okay to not be okay. A lot of people argue that having emotions and mental states that are irrational, like depression or anxiety, are rational responses to an irrational society.
Yeah, we live in a pretty messed up, unhealthy world at the moment, so it's pretty normal that most of us would be struggling in some way to cope with that and to adjust. But yeah, on that note, really, really do try and speak to someone if you're not okay, because the tendency when you're depressed is to just withdraw, and that kind of stops you from getting help. So even if you're struggling and you feel like you have no one to talk to, you can email us. We'll talk to you.
Yeah, we can talk to you.
Anyway, I have a very light-hearted rad today, mostly because we have started running, and I say running very loosely. I don't run. I painfully and slowly jog.
So to correct T, she used to be a badass runner and actually did like 8 half marathons, so she has restarted running. I have started running.
Okay, but I never ran. I've always been slow. I just covered some distance at some point in my life.
8 half marathons. Badass.
Okay. Anyway, not badass at all. A lot of people do that. But in the spirit of running and all the good things that come from running, I thought this was quite a cool little tribute, which we'll link to from runnersguide.co.za. It's not entirely rad because the tribute is about Zeb Luchabe. I think that's how you pronounce his name. But he passed away, and that is not the rad part of my rad, but the tribute to him is. So basically, the Comrades Marathon Association did a tribute to him. He passed away when he was 92 years old, and he was the oldest finisher of the Comrades Marathon in 2003. So basically, he started running when he was 56, and he carried on running until he was about 62, and then attempted his first Comrades Marathon. That in itself, I think, is incredible. To start running at 56, and by 62, you're ready for Comrades.
That is really good.
So the Comrades Marathon is 89 kilometers. That is a far, far way to run for most people.
It's an ultra marathon.
Yeah. So he did he attempted his first one at the age of 62. I think he finished the distance, but not in the allotted time. But he carried on trying to do Comrades, and eventually finished in the right amount of time on his 11th attempt.
Wow.
So he ran Comrades 11 times, and eventually at the age of 76, he successfully completed it. And I just
Wow.
thought that was such a nice story because he actually also carried on running into his 90s and kind of tried to inspire young people in the community to also take up running and healthy lifestyles and stuff. So I thought that was just a feel-good story, especially when I'm feeling old and behind in life and too lazy to run 10Ks.
Although we just did 2 10K races.
We did. Yay, us.
That's a cool story, T. Thanks. But so adding on to that, I would like to say that running is a rad that I was going to mention. So that's cool. I've realized that running is a really freeing, solitary thing to do. And I find that I do a lot of thinking. There's been studies that have shown that running directly helps with anxiety and depression and mental health issues. A lot of ex-addicts become runners and ultramarathon runners. Another book that I read recently was Eat and Run by Scott Jurek, and he mentions how some of the ultramarathon runners are ex-addicts, because it can kind of match the intensity of the addiction. And I find the same thing with running, kind of being able to match anxiety and depression that I deal with. And even Matt Haig mentions in the book that I just mentioned that you should try running. So I've also find running very freeing. It's also very cheap compared to a lot of sports. You just need a pair of shoes and then you can just run. Don't worry about necessarily nutrition and calorie counting and distance and everything. Just run and enjoy it. I mean, it's really difficult at first. It took me ages to get into, but I actually have started to really enjoy it, and now I run pretty much every second day.
And Pete's very fast.
No.
It's those long legs. One step is like the size of a normal person's 3 steps.
Whatever.
You're just basically flying over everyone as you run. No, that's very cool. I'm glad you're running now. Then we also have kind of a joint ride. Last week we went to watch the documentary at Bioscope in Joburg called Everything Must Fall, which centers around the Fees Must Fall movement in South Africa. And I thought it was a really, really good, informative documentary and an important one for everyone to watch.
I would regard it as something important to watch in terms of South Africa's history because it's a recent thing that's happened that was nationally very important. And what's cool is that Fees Must Fall was very much about students, but they also integrated other things into it that kind of paralleled with that fight. So, patriarchy must fall is something that they included, and Roads Must Fall, which came from UCT, and it was kind of like a precursor to Fees Must Fall. And it was about student fees, but actually about a lot more than that. They also...
And workers as well at the university.
So that's what I was going to say. They through the Fees Must Fall movement of students, they managed to achieve insourcing at a major university here, which is a really big deal. And it's very encouraging because it shows the power that people have when we can organize and actually change our situations. It's a total example of direct democracy happening. They weren't just maybe we should just vote or something. They actually did things and mobilized and organized themselves.
Yeah.
So it's a highly recommended documentary, Everything Must Fall.
Yeah, I went and had a look where you can watch it, and they're still doing screenings. I think there's still, I don't know, by the time this episode comes out, if they would have been done, but I think there was still some coming up in Cape Town, but then there were some going other places in the world as well, screening. So I don't think it's available to kind of buy or watch yet. I think they're still just doing screenings at the moment, but it's definitely worth keeping an eye out to watch that if you get a chance.
Yeah, and as soon as we find out more about that, we'll post it on our social media.
Yeah,
so
definitely. Then the last rad we have is kind of a listener rad, actually. So thank you, Chloe, for sending this to us. And we decided to discuss it today because it's actually very relevant to the topic today. And it's a workbook called Me and White Supremacy. And it's by Layla F. Saad. And it's basically a 28-day workbook for white people and people who benefit from whiteness. And it covers topics like white supremacy, privilege, white fragility, cultural appropriation, and feminism, amongst others. So we'll link to that in the show notes and maybe share it on social media in some other ways as well. But if you are white, you should definitely download this workbook and check it out. I haven't been through the whole thing. I've just kind of skimmed over it. I'm going to go through it properly, but we'll discuss some parts of it in the discussion today.
it looks really, really cool. So yeah, thanks for sending that through, Chloe. Maybe we can actually just post a link to the PDF somehow.
Well, she asks that you don't share the PDF directly because she also sends emails to kind of encourage working through the workbook. So she prefers that you go to the site and download it yourself and kind of subscribe. So we'll rather link to it in that way.
Cool. So let's just jump into it. So to define white privilege, trusty Wikipedia actually has a pretty good definition, and they define it as societal privilege that benefits people whom society identifies as white in some countries beyond what is commonly experienced by non-white people under the same social, political, or economic circumstances.
There's also an essay by Peggy McIntosh, which is quite well known in the discussions of white privilege. It's called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And she defines white privilege in part as a package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah, I think it's an important part of the definition in that a lot of white people have never really acknowledged white privilege or were kind of taught to ignore it.
But I think in any dominant system, it's often in that system's interest for you to remain oblivious of the system, actually.
Yeah.
So that it can just kind of perpetuate itself and keep running.
Without being questioned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Peggy McIntosh actually came to write about white privilege through gender studies, as far as I can understand. And she was originally talking more about male privilege, and she likened white privilege to the acknowledgement of men that women are disadvantaged, but not that they are overprivileged themselves. And I think that's important because in a similar way with white privilege, a lot of white people are able to acknowledge that people of color are disadvantaged, but they're not as willing to admit their own overprivilege.
Or that they even have any privilege.
Yeah.
A lot of people. So, yeah, my understanding of privilege and kind of what I keep in mind when I hear it is that it's basically is thinking that something is a non-issue because it doesn't affect you. So obviously, we live in a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. So white people, and especially white men, are going to think that issues that affect people of color are a non-issue because they themselves are not affected by those issues at all.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And to take from the Me and White Supremacy workbook, she also mentions Peggy McIntosh and says that Peggy McIntosh used the term white privilege in her 1988 paper, White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. So that was the original essay where she kind of made that connection, as far as I can tell. And then the Invisible Knapsack essay is a kind of condensed version of that paper.
Wow, so she wrote this in 1988, and it is 2019, and most white people still deny white privilege even exists.
Yeah, it's ridiculous to think. In the workbook, white privilege is also explained as being unearned advantages because of whiteness. It is separate from but intersects with other privileges like class, gender, age, sexuality. And a very important point here is that not having wealth does not cancel out white privilege.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people jump to privilege, meaning financial privilege or economic privilege, but that has nothing to do with white privilege.
Or when you've been told, oh, you have white privilege, you take that on as like, oh, I have an easy life, I'm wealthy.
Yeah, exactly. But I think we'll discuss that a little bit more in a bit.
So white privilege is obviously a real thing, and we've kind of defined what it is, but why do you think that acknowledging it and understanding it is important?
Well, again, in the workbook that I mentioned, there's a pretty good explanation. And to quote, "You cannot dismantle what you cannot see. You cannot challenge what you do not understand." So I think this episode is really important because we need people to, first of all, acknowledge that white privilege is actually a thing, but then also realize that in order to challenge it, we have to understand it. We can't just brush over these issues and pretend they're going to go away. We have to really unpack them and make sure we know what we are tackling. She also goes on to say that it doesn't mean you didn't work hard for your achievements. It just means that you've had an advantage since birth and have less barriers than people of color. So it's not to say that your life has been easy. It's just that your starting points were not the same.
Yeah.
Then Peggy McIntosh, also to quote from her paper, says, "My schooling gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor, as an unfairly advantaged person, or as a participant in a damaged culture." I think that that's an important point.
Yeah.
Kind of hinting at the idea that we are kind of taught to not see
Yeah.
white privilege.
And the fact that the school and education systems come from white colonial thinking. To me, it makes sense. Like, why would this European education system teach you about something that it basically reinforced throughout history?
Like she says, I was never taught to see myself as an oppressor. We as white people were never told that we are taking part in oppression, even if it's not intentional or direct. We are benefiting from past oppression, and as such, without acknowledging that, we are perpetuating that oppression.
And current oppression, because white supremacy is still a thing. That's the world is like basically runs on that.
I think this point by Peggy McIntosh is also really, really important in that the idea of privilege is more complicated than just taking away certain things from some people or giving things to other people. And she says, we need a more finely differentiated taxonomy of privilege, for some of these varieties are only what one would want for everyone in a just society, and others give license to be ignorant, oblivious, arrogant, and destructive. I think it's important because, you know, we all want to kind of be on the same playing field, but some manifestations of privilege, for example, being able to walk in a shop without being followed, you know, or questioned as to whether or not you're trying to steal something, that is a privilege everyone should have. Everyone should be able to walk into a shop without being assumed to have criminal intent. There are other privileges inherent in white privilege that are not like that. They are privileges that just allow ignorance and arrogance, like she says, where, for example, you don't have to necessarily care about someone else's culture or whether or not you've offended them by the way you are acting. That is a part of white privilege that should just be removed. Yeah. Not granted to everyone, but we should all just learn to be better. So I think that's an important distinction.
It's a really good quote.
And related to that, she also says that, you know, the different interlocking types of oppression take different forms. They take both active forms, which we can see, and embedded forms, which as a member of the dominant group, one is taught not to see. So again, there's that distinction between, for example, overt racism and then this insidious underlying systemic oppression that we as white people often don't even notice.
Yeah. So you will notice and see and take issue with blatant things like hate speech or physical violence to individuals, but then not see banks or the Western Cape government evicting people and demolishing houses as like systemic and institutional racism. And which is, I would argue, is more violent than like someone fighting someone else.
Yeah, and I think we end up hitting major problems where the overt, very obvious acts of racism seem to get a little bit better, or, you know, they don't occur as frequently, and then white people tend to think everything's fine and peachy. Like, there's no racism going on around me, so everything's fine. And it's that kind of denial of the underlying stuff that is a problem. And Peggy McIntosh also says the silences and denials surrounding privilege are the key political tool here. And I think that's important, is that those underlying issues are the most important and they're the most easily overlooked.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that phrase, silence is violence. You know, by being ignorant of and silent around privilege, you are perpetuating it and allowing it to carry on. You know, you see it a lot, I think about in terms of sports. Like, white people love when there's national sports happening, like rugby, you know, because it's a way you can kind of get a lot of people of different cultures and stuff distracted and be like, oh, you know, it was so nice that one day with that rugby match when everyone just got along and race wasn't a thing, you know, not knowing that the rest of the days everyone is dealing with their everyday life, and most likely, if they aren't white, dealing with racism on a daily basis. But this like need for you not to talk about race, or like for it not to be in the discussion and just be distracted and kind of, you know, oh, we sing Kumbaya and all get along and that's how I wish it could just be all the time, without ever acknowledging or trying to dismantle the things keeping everyone oppressed and separate, is highly problematic to me.
But I guess things like sport worldwide do that. They numb and distract people. I'm just going to put it out there. I hate sports.
But like you saw it, for example, when they had the World Cup in Brazil. You know, everyone is getting along and whatever, but what the media aren't showing is that there's like massive protests happening with the poor and working class in the street right outside the stadium.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the kind of denial of white privilege, I thought it was quite important to think about why so many people seem to ignore or deny or not even know that white privilege exists. And there was quite a good article on tolerance.org, which again we will link in the show notes, where they discuss a possible reason why the term white privilege itself has such a negative reaction a lot of the time from white people. And they say the two terms create a pushback. Firstly, the word white creates a discomfort among those who are not used to being defined or described by their race.
Really good point.
Because if you think about it, whiteness is the norm.
Yeah.
So as white people, we're not used to being referred to as that white guy or that white woman, or there's quite a lot of like frustrating examples where people will say, oh, I was cut off by this black guy in traffic. And it's like, what relevance does his race have?
But if you just say, oh, I was cut off by this idiot, it's assumed that the person was white because you haven't mentioned it.
Yeah.
And like another good example is one of Trevor Noah's stand-up performances. And he was talking about when he first got to America, you know, his reflections on it. And he also mentions like, why are there prefixes for all the other types of Americans other than white Americans? Because they are just called Americans. Like you get Native American, African American, but no, there is no prefix for like a white American person. They are just American.
So yeah, as white people, we're not used to being referred to by our race. And it is just blatant racism, especially when people, like the example I used, out of frustration are saying, oh, this black guy did this or whatever. By calling their race into the equation, you're saying that somehow race is relevant in your annoyance.
Yes.
As if all people of that race would behave in that way. It's completely irrelevant. It's just racist.
And it's so funny that people who speak like that are also generally the ones saying, oh, why does it always have to be about race?
Yeah, exactly. So going back to this article, the second reason that the two terms white and privilege create pushback is that the word privilege, especially for poor and rural white people, sounds like a word that doesn't belong to them. So it's like a word that suggests they have never struggled. And I think this is the main issue where people recoil and say, whoa, I'm not privileged, because they don't feel like it's relevant to them, but they're misunderstanding the use of the word.
They're misunderstanding the use of the word. I mean, I heard this thing a while ago. I would credit whoever, but I can't remember where I heard it. It was a long time ago, but I've kind of kept it close. What do you say when people play down the idea of white privilege because, you know, they say, oh, I've worked hard or I've made it on my own, which is bullshit. No one has ever made it on their own. But I think a good thing you can say is that no one has ever said that you haven't had a hard life or worked hard to be where you are, but your life has not been made harder because of your race. That's the gist of it. Like, yeah, maybe your life has been super hard, but it would have been harder if you were black.
Yeah, or the reasons for your difficulties are not based on your race.
Yes.
And an important point here is that the defensiveness that comes from recoiling from these two terms just derails constructive conversation. So it stops us from moving forward and from understanding our privileges and how we can overcome them, because it just makes the conversation about the person who is getting defensive.
And I think that comes from generally as a society of how we relate to each other, which, I mean, you could critique in a lot of other ways, like capitalism forces us to see each other as competition or whatever, and so discourages listening. But I think that listening is the issue, that someone says, you have white privilege. So you have a choice of either to listen and understand or feel guilty and react defensively, which is the majority of the time. And then, yeah, it derails any kind of constructive conversation from happening. So everyone is just super angry all the time.
Yeah, it's like, you have privilege. No, you have privilege.
Yeah. I didn't have privilege. After my private school and university, I had to work very hard.
Yeah. So I think it's also important to realize or to acknowledge that white privilege exists because of historic racism and bias and ongoing racism and biases. And having and recognizing the fact that you have white privilege is not the same as being racist. They're very closely tied, but I think that's also why a lot of people get defensive, is they assume that by acknowledging they have white privilege, they are acknowledging that they are racist, which, let's be honest, they probably are. We probably all are, and we all have to keep working on being better. But basically, racist systems contribute to racial biases. And those racial biases are what feed into and create white privilege. Because you have assumptions about yourself and about other people that are born out of a racist environment, and that makes privilege so normalized.
But I think it is this kind of feedback loop of like, there was white supremacy, and then that created this atmosphere of white privilege. And then because we have white privilege, white people like reinforce white supremacy because it's in their best interests. And then everything reinforces white privilege, which reinforces white supremacy as a system.
And then we don't acknowledge our privilege, so we keep acting in the same ways that reinforce white supremacy.
Yeah.
So in case there's anyone that still doesn't really believe that white privilege is a thing, we thought we'd include a few everyday examples just to show what kind of manifestations of white privilege can be found pretty much anytime, any day.
Yeah, just so that it said, even just denying that white privilege exists as an everyday example of white privilege.
Exactly.
Just saying. The first one that we have is that you are born into an English or other dominant white language speaking family, and that because of that, no one will ever be surprised at how well you speak English or how articulate you are, and then comment on this.
Yeah. No one's going to comment and say, wow, you're so smart, you speak English so well if you're white, because it's expected.
Exactly, and most likely you've also been taught the right accent of English.
Yeah, I think this is one that a lot of people don't acknowledge, but it's important because this goes for struggling with the language as well, not just the accent. But if you have a foreigner who's speaking with a thick accent, we don't assume, oh, this person is not intelligent. But a Black South African who's speaking English as their second, third, or fourth language, you know, the first assumption often if they're struggling is, oh, this person is not intelligent.
Which I've actually heard before.
Not
like,
cool,
oh,
guys.
They aren't smart because they can't understand what I said. Yeah, you who speak one language.
Exactly.
So why don't you try take instruction in Zulu and then follow it?
Yeah, I would die in a day because I wouldn't get by. The next one is just shopping without being followed or being seen as suspicious, which I think we've kind of gone over.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think this happens really often. I read a blog post recently by a woman who was talking about her partner is a white man, and she's black, and she was telling her partner like her experiences of shopping, and he didn't believe her. He was like, oh, you know, that doesn't happen anymore. Black people don't get seen as suspicious if they're by themselves and walking in a store. So she said, okay, here's an experiment. You stay outside. I'll take the shopping bags, and instead of shopping together, I'm going to go inside by myself and shop and just watch. So she did. She went inside with her bags, and immediately a white shop assistant came up and said, hey, how can I help you? And kind of hovered around her the entire time while she was shopping.
Yeah, and that shop assistant would probably deny that that's what they were doing. But
exactly. They would say, oh, we're just being helpful or whatever. But yeah, if I knew where that post was, I'd post a link, but I can't think of it right now. Also, as a white person, you have probably never had to work to help your parents financially. Yeah, there are people who have been through hard times, and there are poor white people. We aren't not acknowledging that, but we are saying that it's very unlikely, as your typical white person, that you have had to work to help your parents pay for your school fees, to maybe buy your own school uniforms, to support your younger siblings.
Yeah, and that's, like you said, it's not to say that there are no white people who would have to work to support their families at all, but it's much less common. It's much less of a norm that you would be quitting school, for example, to put your younger siblings through basic schooling. It's not just a case of like helping out during university or something. It's like the basics.
Yeah.
The next example is a misunderstanding and trivializing of race as being only about the color of your skin, when race is much larger and contains culture, language, and historical context.
That's a good point, because often people have a very simplistic understanding of race, when race itself is like this much bigger thing that contains historical context and language, which can't be ignored. It's not just about the color of your skin. And I think that itself is a privileged and ignorant understanding, and it's almost like this fairy tale of, oh, we're all born with the same circumstances and life experience, but we just have different skin colors.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that, again, the language, culture, all of that stuff has also been influenced by historical context and oppression.
Exactly. One that really gets to me, and I hate it, is when people use the term colorblind. It is one of the grossest displays of ignorance and privilege, because you are essentially denying the lived experiences of another and telling them to shut up because it makes you uncomfortable to talk about race.
Yeah.
Race exists, difference exists, disparities exist, And it's important to acknowledge and confront those things rather than trying to be blind towards them. That's not going to help anyone except your own feeling of not being challenged or feeling guilty.
Yeah, and I think this ties into the previous point, actually, now that you mention it, because it's easy to just say, okay, cool, let's forget about the color of our skin. But the oppression that has occurred because of different skin colors, even though the color of your skin is an arbitrary way to distinguish people and to oppress and to divide and all of those things, because those divisions and oppressions have occurred, it creates these distinctions in culture and in understandings and lived experience that are very, very important and can't just be forgotten. And this concept of colorblind, in case anyone is a little bit confused, was a kind of campaign that happened very much around Fees Must Fall, actually. And I'd gone back to varsity at the time, and so many white kids, after Fees Must Fall, thought they were being anti-racist by wearing shirts that said #colorblind. They did not even understand that they were just saying race doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And just saying, oh, we're all the same, Rainbow Nation, everything's happy, everything's fine, we're not racist.
Yeah, so please stop using the term colorblind. It doesn't help anyone or anything.
Yeah. Then the next example is whiteness being the dominant culture. We've kind of touched on this, but again, with, interactions ignoring race and ignoring culture, there's no penalty for white people for overlooking someone's culture or language or disrespecting them. White people completely walk over other cultures and don't get any backlash at all.
Yeah, and when they get called out on their bullshit, they wonder if they are being oppressed.
Yeah.
So talking about dominant culture, that comes from the things that build culture. So like education, and if there's religion and philosophy, things like that. And we need to acknowledge that our religions, the majority of mainstream philosophy and psychology, like European education and understanding and logic, is all white European ways of being and modes of thinking. So like, for example, if you look at like Christianity, so often Jesus is portrayed as like this white guy with blonde hair, which is ridiculous. He would have been born in the Middle East and it would have been Arabic. God, the Father, in air quotes, is seen as like an old white man.
Yeah, obviously it's an old white dude, hey?
The majority of mainstream philosophy and psychology based on a European understanding and logic. So most of our philosophers, look at Freud or like Marx even, all old white dudes.
And most of science and most educational fields actually is just knowledge that comes from white dudes because they were the only ones allowed to even practice things like science.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Also not to distract from the fact that they were all men.
Yes, exactly.
So
another pretty basic but overlooked example is products available when shopping for basics, like plasters that only come in stereotypically white skin tone, or hair products that are only really suitable for so-called white hair. A lot of the makeup products and things like that, especially in South Africa in recent years, I've found it quite surprising when you go to some kind of mainstream stores and you'll see foundation colors from light to dark, but dark is just like a tanned white girl from Santon.
Yeah.
That's like dark.
Yeah.
And then light is like pasty Irish.
I never thought about the plasters thing until a few years ago, because that's like one of the things that white supremacy and white privilege does, is tell you you are the norm. So, yeah, I've cut myself, I'm going to get plasters. You don't consider, well, I mean, at least I didn't, and now I do, and I see it as a major issue, that the plasters come in your skin tone. So when you put it on, the reason why it's that skin tone is so that it's not that noticeable on you. But if you have like a really high count of melanin in your skin and you're a black person and buy a regular plaster, it's going to stick out worse than your cut. So it is like such an example of white privilege to not even think about the fact that the products we buy are just for us.
Yeah.
Expecting people of color to educate you on why something is problematic, racist, or bothers them.
This is a big one. I think, when these kind of oppressive realities are your lived experience, you really shouldn't be expected to also then take more energy to explain to white people why what they're doing is shitty. So white people, we can actually educate ourselves on a lot of these things and discuss these things ourselves. And yes, listen when people of color want to talk and acknowledge what they're saying, but don't expect them to explain to you in baby step terms why what you've done is shitty.
That famous white proverb. But how is that racist?
Oh, white people. Anyway, The next example is talking condescendingly about the right way to protest, be angry, or show emotion when people of color bring up racist issues, criticizing the ways people protest to argue for their rights and perspectives.
I hate it when there's a service delivery protest or something relevant to people of color or poor communities that does not affect white people at all, and then white people have all their opinions. You know, oh, I sympathize with their cause, but the way they did that was wrong. Or like, you know, why do they have to protest like that?
Oh, I understand the students need better fees, but why must they destroy statues? Because Rhodes was a fucking racist, that's why.
He was.
Or like, why do they have to burn things? Or why do they have to break things? Yeah, sure, that's not really ideal to, you know, have to break shit or destroy books or whatever. But if you've been oppressed for so long, nobody's listening to you, you're frustrated, literally your life and your livelihood is on the line and nobody's listening. White people, what would you do? Would you engage in a friendly debate? Maybe you'd write a letter to a minister and you'd probably get heard better because you're white, but what would you do?
You have absolutely no right to criticize how someone protests or riots or tries to make their voice heard when they are victims of oppression.
Yeah, exactly.
Wanting a white president in an African country and voting for a political party that is very white and reinforces whiteness. The DA political party is like a white person's party. You know, it's just obvious in the Western Cape, for example, that their interests are to protect the interests of the ruling class. And like voting for the DA, even if now the white woman has been replaced with a young black man, still reinforces whiteness as a norm. And they very much serve the interests of white people.
The funniest is when white people are like, I love that Moosey guy. He's so nice, hey? And he's so well-spoken.
He's one of the good ones.
He speaks English so well, hey?
Besides for like voting for the DA and supporting these problematic political parties, I just so often do not understand what you are doing in South Africa. Like, if you're going to complain all the time and try to make South Africa Europe, just leave and go to Europe. You're not making anything better for anyone. Like, so often I'm like, why are you here? Just leave if you hate it so much.
Also, last time we had a white president.
Yeah, just saying.
Didn't go so well. Anyway, we've touched on this as well, but whiteness being the societal norm and measure of beauty, intelligence, and creativity. We all know that whiteness is just seen as the standard and everything else is diverging from that and is less valued.
Mm-hmm. We've also mentioned this, but thinking that racism is only about blatant hate speech and refusing to see or being ignorant of how race is a much larger institutional and systemic problem. There's a strong argument to make that cannot be racist to a white person because racism is systemic oppression and white people have never been institutionally or systemically oppressed. Yeah, maybe white people have oppressed other white people, but other races have not oppressed white people.
Yeah, that's an important point, and it's something that at one point I remember struggling with understanding, and it's because I think the kind of formalized definitions of racism, there are multiple definitions, and one is just a prejudice against another person based on the color of their skin, and the other definition is the institutionalized systemic oppression of another racial group. But I think that first definition just blurs and confuses things, and that is why I think a lot of white people think, oh, but you were racist towards me because you said something about my race. But they're not understanding that you can be prejudiced towards anyone. Yes. So I think we need to make that distinction and take that first definition away from racism entirely, that racism is only the systemic, institutionalized racism, and any other kind of discrimination based on race directed towards white people is just prejudice.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Or just a little bit of anger. So another example of white privilege is the way that perpetrators of crime are portrayed in the media and news stories and things like that. For example, if there's a white perpetrator, he or she will be described in terms of things other than race versus, oh, this dangerous black shooter. Or you have the Brock Turners of the world who are described in terms of their sport and academic achievements.
Yeah, blatant racism in the way that media portrays race and events that happen around it.
The fact that if you're white, generally you think that cops are your friends and they make you feel safe.
This is a ridiculous example of white privilege. go into townships or into areas like, for example, Ferguson in the US, and ask the local people there whether they think of cops as their friends. Cops are not our friends. Cops are the violent arm of the state that are there to protect the interests of the state, not our interests. Cops are not your friends. Talking about those less privileged than you in condescending, ignorant ways, like saying they should all pull themselves up by their bootstraps or just get a job, both trivializing their experience and arrogantly assuming that you got anywhere in life by yourself.
Yep. Another example is mainstream media constantly reinforcing your worldview, your logic, your skin color, your hair, your language, and your culture. Again, pretty self-explanatory.
But it's important to be aware of that.
Yeah, I mean, even though there has been a little bit of progress, it's not enough, it's not quick enough. Still, if you look at a lot of mainstream media, it's predominantly white. White models, white actors and actresses, white news presenters.
The language of your ancestors, discovering, instead of more truthful terms like invading, pillaging, stealing, murdering, or committing genocide. I know that's not very gentle of me, but the amount of problematic rhetoric used around people like Christopher Columbus, for example, he didn't discover shit. He invaded America and he committed genocide. So use more truthful terms. Don't say America was discovered or Australia was discovered. They were invaded.
We might as well write a book called The History of Shitty Things White People Have Done, a collection of euphemisms. It'll just be a big collection of like things said nicely that were horrific.
Yeah, so I mean, this also points to the way that history is even told from a white supremacist perspective.
Also, believing that the justice and prison systems are fair, just, and unbiased.
Nonsense. If you believe that, you're honestly deluded. And I would highly recommend watching the documentary The 13th.
Brilliant documentary.
And reading the work of Angela Davis. She also pushes for prison abolition. And the prison abolitionist movement is really interesting. And I think their arguments hold a lot of weight that prisons shouldn't even exist in the first place.
Yeah.
Cultural appropriation. So I would say that is like white people using other cultures for fun or to entertain themselves, or to just steal and remove meaning from other cultures and what they do. So for example, like if you use other people's cultures for the themes of your dress-up parties, or you adopt yogi culture and say namaste and everything without acknowledging the history and roots of yogi culture. These are all examples of cultural appropriation and are highly problematic because, say for example, you go dressed up as some kind of culture somewhere, you're literally using someone else's culture as a costume that you can take on and off, when that could be highly insulting and insensitive to the person from that culture who does not have the luxury of taking on and off their skin and culture and their race.
Yeah, and I think it can be quite a tricky thing because there's a difference between cultural appropriation and learning from and embracing other cultures and learning from each other. But I think where this is a huge problem is, like you say, using someone's identity as a costume you can take on and off, especially when you might be wearing something that is culturally symbolic, for example, and you don't even realize that. And it might be a case of that item of clothing is reserved for a specific kind of person, awarded for a specific kind of social feat or something, I don't know. But it could be seen as very disrespectful and offensive. And it just becomes blatantly racist, actually, a lot of the time. I mean, we can learn from each other and we can borrow ideas from each other in a very respectful way. But like you say, to just put on a costume that is someone else's identity is shitty.
Yeah, especially if you're just putting it on to have fun. When the person in that culture could be experiencing like massive systemic racism and have to be dealing with that every day. But it's cool, have fun dressed up as their culture.
Just go as an Avo or something. Then another example is being ignorant of the fact that the more we as white people spend time in white-only or white-dominated spaces, the more white worldviews are reinforced.
That's why it's important to be aware of when you are in a kind of like a white bubble. And that is the only worldview that you are experiencing and exposed to.
And I think the key here is white-dominated spaces. I think that's really important because it's one thing to be in a group of only white people, which, I mean, you could question why that is. But if you're in a space where there are actually different races of people, but the space is still being dominated by white people, that I think is particularly problematic.
Still reinforces the whiteness of the world. Yeah.
But more so because it's not just being stuck in this like echo chamber or bubble of ideas, but actually squashing other ideas that are actually present in the room.
I think a good example is like the hardcore scene. I always find it really weird that it's like mostly white men. And it's encouraging to see in the US at least the scene becoming a lot more diverse, and now there's like actually like feminist bands and kind of scenes, and there's bands like Race Trader that are like calling out white supremacy honestly and are like fronted by someone who's not white. So things are changing, but
just not quickly enough.
Yeah, I would argue not quickly enough. Most likely, you will never, as a white person, have to protest or riot in the streets and put your body on the line just to make your voice heard. So we have alluded to this previously in this discussion, but, you know, it comes from white people so often that they have like the proper ways, or like the right ways in air quotes, of doing things, when it's just an example of your privilege, that you cannot empathize with the fact that the only way other people have to be heard is to literally physically put themselves on the streets and protest or riot, to just be taken seriously.
And risk being the victim of violence as well.
Yeah.
Like police brutality.
Or even getting arrested or shot by rubber bullets, or maybe even, for example, in the case of the Marikana mine massacre, to be shot with live ammunition.
Not everyone can just write a pretty email to the mayor, Deborah. So that was quite a long list of examples, but it's by no means an extensive list. There are a lot more examples of white privilege in everyday life. So we just wanted to make you a little bit more aware of that if you weren't aware of those things as white people, and to just think about them, internalize them, and realize that we can all do better.
So I think it's important to acknowledge at this point that Taryn and I are two white privileged people who are doing this podcast. So we are in no way speaking for or on behalf of anyone who's not white, but we think it is important as white people to kind of call out other white people on the shit.
Yeah, I think we actually probably should have made this little disclaimer earlier on, and I think in our first recording of this episode we did. But disclaimer, we are not talking, as Pete says, on behalf of anyone, but we think these conversations are really, really important because, as we kind of alluded to earlier, it's a lot of mental and emotional labor to explain the shittiness of racism and white privilege to white people who are very resistant to those messages. So I think it's up to us as white people, when we become aware of these things, to discuss it among ourselves and call each other out and learn among ourselves without having to put that burden on people of color to explain it to us over and over and over again.
So while I think it's important to understand terms like white privilege and white supremacy and racism and any other terms, it's also important to acknowledge that a lot of the white privilege and white supremacy comes from colonization of the world, geographic movements of people and everything. And so you'll see as a trend happening in the world at the moment, in the good sense, of decolonization. So in a lot of anti-racism work, you'll hear the terms decolonization, even in education, in the Fees Must Fall movement. The way that we live in the West, in air quotes, is based on white settler colonization. So it's hard to see issues for the majority of white people when the entire structure and system that we live in benefits them. So decolonizing is basically, I guess, breaking things down to include people who aren't white and their ideas and ways of being, and their ideas of what the issues are and what things should be done about those issues.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to realize that when we talk about things like decolonizing education, to me, that doesn't necessarily mean, okay, what, should we just scrap science and scrap all the knowledge that we have? No, that's not it at all. But we need to realize where it comes from. We need to acknowledge the biases and the flaws in the educational systems that we have and the information that we have, and realize that we need to now make space for new ideas from other cultural groups and other racial groups to incorporate other ways of thinking and discovering information and discovering ideas that don't necessarily tie into the established educational packages that we have currently. That's not to say let's scrap everything we know or we think we know, but let's build on it inclusively.
Yeah, exactly. But some stuff does need to be scrapped. For example, the statue of Rhodes at UCT. He was, like you mentioned earlier, a shitty, racist colonizer. And the thing is that the mainstream educational systems were never meant to include people of color. They were set up to educate white people.
White men. Yeah.
Yeah, white men. People wanted to remove the statue because it's a symbol of that, and people resisted it. And it's like, no, this is a symbol of colonization that has to go. Because a part of decolonizing is to make people who aren't white feel welcome in the institutions, and the institutions that were set up for them never to be included in the first place.
Yeah, I find it weird that there's even opposition to that. I mean, if you were to open a university, you wouldn't be stoked to have a huge statue of Hitler outside the entrance. Of course, they would be removed.
Yeah.
Why do you want to honor him? So, same shit.
So, like, if there's a symbol of colonization, of course we should get rid of it. Another term that's good to understand is cultural sensitivity. So, as a white person, you will never really understand cultural insensitivity, because how could someone be culturally insensitive to the dominant culture?
Yeah, like we mentioned earlier, there isn't really any punishment for white people being insensitive to other people's cultures.
And I think this is where, you know, people who are anti, like, PC culture come in, because when they say, oh, you know, now I have to be so careful of what I say and everything I say is wrong and I get called out as racist for anything or whatever, what they're really saying is, I miss the days when black people couldn't talk back to me.
Yeah.
So I read a pretty interesting blog post that I just wanted to share that we'll post a link to in the show notes on Medium, written by Michelle Williams, called White Privilege as Seen by Someone Who Isn't White. And so I read the whole article, but I just took out a couple of points that I thought were pretty good. So she said, I find myself wondering, how did they not know? It's been very apparent to me my entire life that white people have an advantage. So how could they be so oblivious to it? I guess no one notices the runners behind you when you are always in the lead.
I think that's a brilliant quote.
And then just some points she made, I guess, to tie in with our everyday examples. Kind of these were subheadings in the blog post. White privilege is not being born with a short straw. White privilege is never having to explain your intelligence, which we mentioned already. White privilege is never having to worry about being watched. White privilege is being able to live however you see fit, with zero ramifications. White privilege is winning the game before you even roll the dice. So I thought that was pretty good. Another blog post that I just wanted to share, that I just took 3 points out of, was an article on Bright the Mag called Why Are White People So Bad at Talking About Race?, which was written by Courtney Martin interviewing Robin DiAngelo in her book White Fragility. So basically in the interview, Courtney asks Robin, you know, why do you think that the public are so anti the idea of identity politics and basically being defined kind of by our identities and our experiences? And Robin responds that identity politics has obviously become distorted because those who benefit from our current structures have distorted it. It's similar to the idea that naming white men's advantage is bashing white men. No, it's naming facts. If we don't name who is marginalized, we obscure and thus support their marginalization.
I think that's a really important point. And I think this ties into, you know, white people saying, why does everything always have to be about race? And what they're not understanding is that identity politics is so important because by identifying yourself with a specific group, you are enabling yourself to kind of mobilize for a specific cause that is relevant to that group, like fighting for gender equality. You know, you can't really tackle a specific problem specific to a particular group of people without naming that group of people. So, of course, we have to talk about race to break down racial inequality.
Yeah, and I think it comes from this weird idea that some white people have that to use identity is somehow a negative thing and that it's divisive, when it really isn't. I been reading this great book called Aphro-ism by Sil and Afko. It's the subtitle is Essays on Pop Culture, Feminism, and Black Veganism from Two Sisters. And they speak about how it's not a bad thing to use labels and to have identities. So they, for example, consider themselves black feminists. They have friends who consider themselves indigenous feminists. It's not that that is any kind of negative thing, but it does explain the context and thinking that they are coming from. So really, it's a problematic thing. Like we said, being colorblind is a problematic thing, to try and homogenize identity and say we are all the same when it's just factually not true. The other 2 points that I took from the blog post were just 2 quotes that I thought were quite good. People of color don't need white people to speak for them. They need us to hand them the mic.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, in that we need to listen to people of color. And like we were speaking about white-dominated spaces, making room for people of color to speak and letting them have the platform to be heard. And like we mentioned during this podcast, this is not us necessarily handing anyone the mic, but in some situations, I think it's important for white people to speak to each other, to take away that emotional energy required to explain some of this stuff. But when there is a person of color present who has something to say, it's important to let them speak.
And then the next quote is, perhaps we've said enough for a while. Perhaps it's time to listen. So if it hasn't been made obvious right now, a problem and solution to this is to listen, or at least the start of some kind of solution. So you and I are both interested in veganism and animal liberation. And I think it's also important to talk about white privilege within other contexts. And because this is one that we're aware of, I just wanted to make a point here. I have a major problem with how apolitical and how depoliticized veganism and the animal rights movement has become, when I see it very much as a social justice issue and a political stance. And it really bugs me when people say, it's all about the animals. Why does it always have to be about race? So, for example, Afko, in the book that I mentioned, Aphro-ism, she's the founder of Black Vegans Rock, and she did a blog post called #BlackVegansRock 100 Black Vegans to check out. The reaction from the vegan community was really condescending and racist, actually. By saying things like, why does it always have to be about race? Maybe we should have a 100 white vegans rock thing or something. And really, it's problematic because, yes, some people think that veganism is only about speciesism and non-human animal oppression, but it is also about the vegans and activists themselves, because it is specific humans with specific lived experiences and backgrounds who are framing the way that we think about issues and deciding what we should do about those issues. Mainly white men who are doing this. So you cannot remove the context of that. So when we remove identity from veganism or activism, we are enforcing privilege by accepting that there is a more authoritative, dominant, and better way of thinking about things. Why is it that straight white male activists get more attention than thinkers like Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, Christopher Sebastian, or A. Breeze Harper, for example, or Lauren Ornelas from Food Empowerment Project? Why are we only focusing on Joey Carbstrong and Gary Yourofsky? Please stop supporting that guy. And James Aspie and Earthling Ed. It's all straight white men that get all of the attention. And there are thinkers who are, in my opinion, much better for the vegan movement. And the reason why I think that those guys get a lot of attention is because they already sit comfortably within the current system. So they don't challenge anyone because they are the norm already. So they can say, oh, this is only about animals, forgetting that everything is political and that they are actively, by having control of the mic and by saying, these are the problems, this is what we should do about the problems, are reinforcing white supremacy. And that there are thinkers like the ones I mentioned who we should give more attention to. There are groups run by white people that get all of the attention, when there are better groups to follow, such as Food Empowerment Project or the vegan hip-hop movement. It's problematic. And a really good point in Aphro-ism, the book that I mentioned, is that throughout history, there's been this concept of animality. I hope that I'm going to get this right. I've just been reading this book. That animality is a European construct of understanding someone who is less than human. So we've used that logic to oppress animals, and the source of the oppression is the same for racist, non-white oppression. So, for example, black people have been framed as less than the human ideal, which is the white male. So arguably, speciesism and animal liberation has to include things like race, because it's the same source of thinking that oppresses the being that is deemed as less than the ideal human. So it's still related to saying, you know, animals are less than humans, so let's oppress them. Black people are less than white people, so let's oppress them. So you set this idea of what human is, and then it's okay to oppress non-human animals, and their lives and their deaths become these like mundane, everyday things that we can get used to. So I'm not saying that they are the same thing, but the source of the oppressor and the source of the oppression and the oppressive ways of thinking are the same. That's why it's important to include intersectionality and realize that feminism and anti-racism are essential in the animal rights struggle as well.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of classic method of othering that you're talking about, and the process of making other equals less than, basically.
Exactly. And another example just within the animal rights movement is that white people always feel this entitlement to use the oppression of other races and how they've historically been oppressed to gain sympathy for non-human animal oppression, which I think is like a very privileged thing to do when you don't understand historical context and you just trivialize, you know, other oppressions to try and gain sympathy. Like animal oppression is bad enough by itself as well, in my opinion. You don't always have to say, oh, it's like the Holocaust or it's like the transatlantic slave trade or something.
Yeah, and a point I wanted to mention in reference to your earlier point is that what a lot of vegans who say, oh, why can't this all just be about the animals? Humans have lots of causes. Humans have lots of people fighting for them. This is the one place where animals are getting fought for. What they are missing here, like you were saying, the activists are humans that are deciding on what is best to do for the animals. So I think what these activists are missing is that if we are not using inclusive and diverse ideas, we are screwing over the animals, because we are not going to get through to everyone, and we are not going to convince everyone to go vegan if we are only expressing white normative ideas.
Exactly.
It's just not going to work. We can't use one strategy or one kind of strategy to get through to everyone, and we are then inadvertently squashing the voices that could appeal to more people and create a wider, more diverse, more inclusive understanding that will help more animals in the long run.
Exactly.
So it's actually doing a lot of harm to animals as well to ignore the intersectional issues.
Yeah. And a quick example that I often hear as well when doing outreach is when white people say, you know, it's so easy to be vegan, forgetting that what you eat only becomes an issue when you have enough to eat. So it's actually, in my opinion, a privileged thing to say it's easy to be vegan, when people forget about things like food deserts, which are directly linked to racism. You cannot talk about veganism being easy without acknowledging the fact that there are things like food deserts. You cannot think about things like food deserts without also critiquing racism and capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's an important issue, because I think if you're talking to a privileged person, I think it's accurate to say it's easy to go vegan in response to the kind of standard cop-out excuses against veganism or excuses for not going vegan. But like you say, when you think of food deserts and stuff like that, if we were just talking about the animals, what would we do then when we have to acknowledge the fact that there are food deserts, the fact that there are people who just don't have access to fresh fruit and vegetables? What then? If it's just about the animals, that's where we stop and we say, oh well. But if we critique capitalism and we critique all the other injustices, we realize that we can't just say, oh well. It's a fucking problem that it's not easy to go vegan. It should be easy for everyone to go vegan. And that is an issue of food injustice and environmental injustice a lot of the time. And capitalism saying it's more important to have access to junk food and Coke than it is to fruit and vegetables. And that is an injustice against those people and against the animals that get exploited, because that is the only so-called food that those people might have access to. So if you ignore the interlinking oppressions there, you're screwing over the people and the animals.
Exactly. And it's why intersectionality is so important, and why both of us love Steve Best's idea of total liberation, because he argues that you will never achieve animal liberation unless you also tackle things like poverty and patriarchy, because it's just not going to happen. You can't do one without the other. So it's really problematic. when people say, oh, just leave it about the animals, it's all about the animals. I personally am not interested in your veganism if your anti-speciesism is not also anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and anti-patriarchy. I don't see how you can really effectively tackle one without the other.
You can't. You're only going to get so far, and then you're going to hit a wall.
I'm so sick of lifestyle veganism. We need to make veganism political.
Now that we've ranted for an extensive period of time, we thought we should talk about how we dismantle white privilege, how we get past it. Let's get on to a little bit of a more positive note in actually doing something about these issues. So what can we do, Pete? Privileged people.
Okay, so one example a very obvious example is, instead of getting guilty and defensive about the fact that you have privilege, why not use your privilege to help those with less privilege? So for example, if you watch Everything Must Fall, they mention that during the Fees Must Fall protests, white students realized that cops are much less likely to inflict violence on you if you are white and will be less brutal. So they use their own bodies to create a barrier between the students of color and the police, knowing that they are in a way using their privilege to protect those with less privilege because the police won't be as brutal.
Yeah, so acknowledging your privilege again is not saying that you're a bad person or that you should feel guilty for being born white, but just acknowledging that you have that privilege and that you have the privilege then to use that to help others. Another thing we can do is to not tokenize people of color. So if you include a person of color in whatever situation, include them entirely. So listen to their ideas, listen to their opinions, allow them to express their creativity, not just because you want to look more diverse, but because you want to actually create a more diverse environment or community where we are actually sharing diverse ideas and listening to those ideas and incorporating them.
Exactly, and I think this ties in with decolonizing. You know, if a university, for example, wanted to decolonize themselves, put non-white people on the board of directors or whatever, whoever is in charge, and allow them to change things and allow them to have a say in how things change. Don't just maintain the way it was set up by the colonizers. An important thing that we can do as white people is to realize, recognize, and appreciate difference. This goes exactly opposite to that idea of being colorblind. Difference and diversity among people is beautiful. It's important to realize and recognize that we are all different. We all have different life experiences, cultures are different cuisines from different parts of the world are nice. So just don't see it as something that is divisive because we have different identities and labels or different races. That isn't the problem. The problem is trying to make, or at least pretend, that everybody is the same.
And I think also to acknowledge that some of the negative or perceived negative differences, for example, the differences that have been necessitated because of oppression and because of like educational exclusion, those differences are the fault of white people, and we need to acknowledge those as well, and to acknowledge that out of certain struggles that we do not understand comes different strengths and different realizations and different worldviews that we have no knowledge of and that we could benefit from listening to and respecting.
Exactly. Really good point.
The next thing we can do as white people is make space. Step aside, hand over the mic, shut up, listen. Yeah,
which is the next point. Listen. Just fucking listen for once. It's so important as men, as white people, as anyone in a position of privilege to learn when to just shut the fuck up and listen.
Yeah, if the experience being discussed is not one that you have lived yourself, then be quiet. Then realize that if you aren't feeling challenged or confused or conflicted often, then most likely your understanding is just reinforcing your privileged perspective. I think this is important. It's about realizing that you should be grappling with these things often, and that as white people, we all still have a lot of problematic, racist, shitty ideas and shitty ways of thinking that we need to break down and kind of re-educate ourselves and reform our ideas. And that will make us uncomfortable sometimes. It will create conflict or confusion, and we need to grapple with those things and work through them. And if we are not feeling challenged at all, then we're probably just sitting in a little bubble of comfortable privilege.
Exactly. I mean, for example, if we talk about an animal activism again, if you are an intersectional vegan, there will come times, for example, like the Clifton Beach thing that happened, that many of us don't know how to think about. But that is in itself is fine, because there will be these kind of collisions of like, I care about animals, but I also am anti-racist. And so it's important to be in the state of like, what do I think about this? And like, let's have conversations, and let's listen to each other, and let's learn from each other, and what can we do differently, and how can I think about this in a way that's not going to be the same way I've always been thinking comfortably about things.
And without throwing anyone under the bus to prioritize another movement that you support.
Exactly. Call out and challenge racism and white privilege when you hear and see it. This is so important, not only if there are people of color present, but if you're just with your white family and someone is making racist jokes or whatever, call it out. Silence is complicity, and silence is violence. Understand and acknowledge that as a white person, you will never understand what it is like to not be white in this world. And that's why it's so important to listen, because you cannot know what it's like to be a person of color.
And then related to sticking up for people of color is to be a witness. Even if you can't necessarily intervene in some situations, look at what's happening, acknowledge what's happening, capture what is happening. If there is something problematic going on that you can then help to speak up against, even if you can't directly intervene in, for example, a violent situation.
Yeah, that's why solidarity is so important. To just be like, I'm here, I see you, I'm on your side. Sometimes that's all you can do, and that's also very important. I think it's also a really good idea to consume non-white media. So read books written by people of color, listen to musicians who are people of color, support things that people who aren't white are doing. Typically, media is dominated by white people, and it reinforces white supremacy and white privilege constantly.
Yeah, I think that's important because, like you say, the media is not going to favor those people. So also if you read a really good book by a person of color, or you find a band or whatever it may be, share it as well with the people that you know and recommend it, and give them a bit of a push, because they're probably not going to get it from the media or mainstream anything.
Yeah, don't be insincere about it. If it's shit, don't push it.
Yeah, of course. But yeah,
exactly.
Then also, when talking about issues of race and white privilege, I think it's important for us not to take it personally or disengage if we feel that discomfort that we spoke about. Just because something makes you uncomfortable or your kind of instinctive response is defensiveness, just stop, take a breath, and listen before you disengage. Because as soon as you disengage or you start getting defensive, you're just derailing the conversation. And it's important to not take these discussions personally. It's not always about you personally. It's about a systemic problem. So just listen and see how you can be better.
It's so important to listen. Just as a final note, I wanted to say that I think that white privilege is inseparable from patriarchy, speciesism, and other schools of thought that enforce domination and oppression. Everything that we think and believe and value inform and are informed by the other things that we think and believe and value. So it is essential that if we want any kind of strong, legitimate movement, that our lens of understanding is intersectional and political.
Beautifully said, Pete.
Thank you, Taryn.
So we've had quite an extensive conversation about this topic, and hopefully you're not quite as exhausted as we are after recording this for the second time. But thank you so much for listening if you've listened this far, and stick around for the song at the end if you usually stop listening around here, because we have a band called Soundz of the South that we think you should check out.
So Soundz of the South, spelled Soundz, is an anti-capitalist cultural resistance movement working with activists who use hip-hop and poetry to spread revolutionary messages, raise consciousness, and critique neoliberalism. They are awesome, from the Western Cape, and you should check them out. We'll post a link to all of their profiles in the show notes. So the song is called They Feed On It.
Yeah, so thanks again for listening. If you have any comments or questions, hit us up on social media or email letsragetogetherpodcast@gmail.com. Until next time,
love and liberation.
Fighting for poverty ways. Quarter and them anti-speciesism. In case you didn't know, if you vote, you in on it. You in on it. You in on it. SABC, SAB, FZB, BEE. Capitalist pyramid scheme. They feed on it. They feed on it. feed on it. Elections serve the system like a chalkboard duster. Voting only allows you to choose a new master. To hide the ugliness of government with a plaster. It's a shame when you keep recycling these bastards. With your democracy is a mockery. We don't want your loaf, we want to run the bakery. Vote for any party and expect treachery. You're mandating them to feed off the common treasury. Open up your eyes, truth is plain to see. Reality check from the big or MC. Smash the TV, smash the radio. Build community control of the media. Toy can coexist with dictatorship. This art form defies all forms of censorship. The culture is HIP, HOP. Only subjectivity will set the people free. The Marikana massacre, they eat money. Farm work exploitation, they eat money. And if you didn't know, if you vote, you eat money. Say what? You eat money. Say what? You eat money. ANC, the DA, they eat money. Blood-sucking politicians, they eat money. Capitalist pyramid scheme, they feed on it. Say what? They feed on it. Say what? They feed on it.
Kamahasha yalikaba kanti watsara ngemisila. Kale nisbeka mabala qaqhuma inqindi kusliwa. Funga amaqabane kwesihlanjo kuzawunyiwa. The statement is clear, voting is nonsense. EFDA, African National Congress. Ha, lama khalanga qapikas lama khoma. Mensa yala mutwakarab. The freedom charter vast neta cover up for capitalist hidden agendas. Hence I say we need more than food, clothes and shelter. Cause the government has no interest to the workers. Dala minyaka idlula zuma siqhathaza zimbula sithula sixakene nenduma sivula sikhala zakozuma. Kucace mhlophe zezimpuku ziluma sivuthele. Sibona ubaluleka xa kufika ixesha losivotela.
As a young boy I was told, my voice is my voice, but growing up I was told, your vote is your voice. Wathuma grace amandla ngawethu nomhlaba ngowethu. Wathuma deep amandla ka-X, who governs you next is the one. You giving your power, that piece on that paper. Dala nibukela spota sibabeka kwi-power. Scoop abamhlophe ngubevanga sifaka abamnyama. And things don't change, reality still remains. We're stuck in this cage called ghetto life, it's a shame. That's why I never vote, I never choose my master. And that's why keeping my ex to reclaim my power. So when we organize, we mobilize from the bottom against all forms of oppression, against domination, against exploitation and corruption. United as communities, people shall govern. Amandla ngawethu.